Well, this spring's weather was certainly variable across the country. Some areas were too dry, some were too wet, and many areas saw some stand issues in corn and soybeans.
Well, a lot of the stand issues had to do with cold temperatures, and I guess that's what we wanted to talk about a little bit today. How can you overcome these things so you don't have stand issues again in the future?
Well, when you have perfect conditions for planting, it's warm, the soil is dry, everything's working out just right with your planter, we typically don't see a lot of stand issues. But this year, it seems like everything was wrong. It was either too cold or, worse yet, too cold and too wet, and crop was getting put in. And when you've got the conditions just perfectly set for disease and insect problems, it's no wonder that we have some stand issues out there.
All right, but there are a couple other things going on too. It's also residue management and it's that surface crusting. So how are you going to overcome residue, surface crusting, diseases, and insects? Those are really the four things that we're talking about here. And I got so tired this spring of everybody talking about, oh, the soils are too cold to plant corn. No, they're not. You have to treat your seed right though if it's going to survive in those cold temps. So in other words, you've got to have that residue taken care of. You want to have high organic matter levels and not have surface crusting issues. We can talk about that just a little bit more too. But the big things are, what we did on our farm is we put headline down in furrow on all of our corn seed. We also used quick rits and we used insecticide. So if you're doing a fungicide and insecticide in addition to the seed treatment you already have, plus a biological or natural seed treatment like a quick rits that's got beneficial bacteria and fungi, then you add extra protection there against diseases, against bugs, and get a little bit extra kick early on. We saw a very noticeable difference where this was done versus where it wasn't done. I think that's a huge thing if you're going forward. And like Darren said, if you're going to plant into warm soils, you got no issues out there whatsoever, it's not nearly as big a deal. But let's face it, when we're in the northern part of the country, every year we're planting into cold, wet soils. Every year. So you got to do something about that so you don't continue to have stand issues going forward.
Well, you may be sitting there listening to this thinking, hold on now. That's going to be really expensive to do all that stuff at planting time, and it certainly is an investment that you'll have to choose to make. But you really need to look at what the return on investment is with these different pieces. Like the headline, for example, in furrow. We tried it a couple years ago on a small amount of acres. Last year we did it on more acres, and it really worked, and we had differing weather conditions, and we thought it worked very well for us. So this year we went ahead.
We knew it worked very well because we had yield gain, and that's what it all comes back to at the end of the season.
So we put it on the whole farm. So we put it on the whole farm this year, and then you look at the different pieces there. Insecticide. We've been using insecticide on our corn plantings really as long as I can remember, but with Bt traits, I know there are a number of farmers that have gone away from using insecticide, but when you've got a year like this where the corn is going to have to sit in the ground for a long period of time, it really pays to have some added insecticide on to try and kill a lot of those bugs before they take a bite out of your root system, plus all those bugs like seed corn beetles, seed corn maggots, things that are in the soil that really those BTs aren't going to protect you against. Having additional insecticide in the furrow is really invaluable on a year like this.
The other thing we haven't talked about yet is in-furrow fertilizer. We advise you to put a little bit of in-furrow fertilizer down, but mix it with some water and use low salt products. If you have too much fertilizer, that actually can hurt you more than it can help you, especially in a year like this one. But if you do have a little bit of fertilizer out there just to help get that plant started, get that young seedling off and growing better, it really does make a difference in a year like this when it is cool early in the spring. So there are all these factors that we want you to take a look at, and that's corn. When we talk about soybeans, it's just a little bit different.
Well, it is a little bit different, but one thing that's constant, Brian, that I should mention before we leave the corn topic is just this. When you have a spring where it's too wet, and if you're in North Dakota, Minnesota, Ohio, I mean, there's just a bunch of different areas where it's way too wet this spring, we've got to have good drainage out in those fields. Now, I understand in North Dakota, that ground was frozen till well into May, so our drain tile wasn't really even running yet.
Yeah, but let's talk about why it was frozen. If you have too much water, then it's going to freeze up hard, and that frost isn't going to come out in the spring. If you've got the water table down, you're going to find your soils warm a lot more quickly.
And yes, getting that water down in the fall is great. We don't have flooding issues in the fall. Then that soil is set to absorb more moisture in the spring.
So in other words, what we're telling you is if you were in an area that was too wet to plant, get some tile in the ground. It's a tremendous investment. Best thing we've ever spent money on our farm. It's way better, a way better every year return than herbicide, than fertilizer, than insecticide. It's the best thing we've ever invested in on our farm. Let's come back to the surface crusting just a little bit because that is something that can affect corn and soybeans?
Well, and there's a lot of reasons, and it was interesting. We were just having a discussion off camera about some strip till that we had done that had a little bit of crusting, but nothing like we're seeing.
Yeah, but let's talk about
where there's
why.
Heavy conventional tillage.
Right, let's talk about why. This is some new ground that we picked up that has low organic matter levels, and that's a big problem. If you've got low organic matter on your farm, you're more prone to have crusting issues. So over time, what do you want to do? You want to build up the organic matter levels. That means reducing tillage and planting high residue crops like corn and wheat.
Well, that's another thing too, where gypsum is a soil amendment, or you could look at it as a nutritional supplement to your soils. But in this case, when we talk about soil crusting, I look at gypsum as a soil
calcium
amendment
in general
that helps reduce that crusting potential for you.
Yep, either gypsum or lime, just get some more calcium out there. The whole thing is we want to have a higher concentration of calcium, a lower concentration of magnesium, and you're less likely to have that soil crusting issue.
Okay, now you talked about residue management. We saw a lot of issues with that this year. If you had corn stalks and you rotated to soybeans, and there were quite a few acres across the country shifting from corn over to soybeans, we had a lot of residue to deal with, and we had a cool and in many cases wet spring. It's tough to get that residue to move around, to get it chopped up properly, and so we saw some issues with hairpinning. We also saw some issues where that residue covered over the row. It blew over later because of a lot of the wind that we had this spring, and we had some seed that just couldn't push through all that residue. So getting residue managed properly is important. For us, we think here again is where a chopping corn head comes into play, and being aggressive with those residue managers on your planter to get that residue out of the way.
So what we're saying is we really encourage you to use a chopping corn head. It's something that we used to not have a chopping corn head on our farm in no-till or in strip-till. There's no way that I'm going back to that in the future. We've got to have the chopping corn head out there. It makes it so much better dealing with the residue the following spring. We have a lot less hairpinning of residue. We have a lot better stands. Residue management is dramatically improved when you use that chopping corn head.
You know, with soybeans, we talk about the in-furrow and seed treatment piece, and definitely this year the fungicides on the seed treatment paid back big returns. We saw a lot of issues with Pythium, with guys that were trying to get away from using fungicides that thought, I don't want to spend all that money this year. I'm just going to cut my costs here. Maybe I'll just use some inoculant. And while inoculant's fine, I'm not encouraging you to go away from that. You definitely need to have that fungicide piece as well. And I believe this year the insecticide is going to prove, when we get some yield data back on trials where there was Poncho, Gaucho, Cruiser used versus none, I think that's going to pay some big dividends too. We saw a lot of early issues with wireworm.
Well, once again, there were a lot of stand issues this year, and I realize they were because of the cold, wet conditions. But all we're trying to say is we're going to have cold, wet conditions again in the future. So either you can get prepared and do some of these extra things, fungicide, insecticide, biological seed treatments, manage that residue a little bit better, use some in-furrow fertilizer, or delay your planting. You've got two choices there. But when you go out and continue to do the same thing you've done in the past, you're going to continue to have the issues you've had in the past, and it does come down to stand. And certainly there are variety differences and everything else, but let's face it, I don't care what variety you've got. If you treat that seed better, you manage the residue better, you get some fertilizer in there, you've got a lot better chance to have a great stand, whether it's corn or soybeans or any crop you've got.
And of course, weed control is another critical component to having a successful crop. We'll show you how to stop this tough weed later in the show.